Responsibilities in Joint Operations, Chapter 16, Qualifications and Certification of Locomotive Infrastructure. Except the minimum joint operation pursuant to Statute 24229F, the regulation recognizes the several parts of the responsible safe operation of locomotive terrain joint operation territory. It identifies the duties. For instance, the engineer must be qualified in the territory over he or she is operated, but the operator that has a duty immediately notifies to his or her railroad employer that he or she is not qualified to perform that service. See Title 24229C3. Similar engineers, railroad employees, i.e. foreign or Gus Railroad, shall determine the engineer is both certified and qualified to operate the joint operating territory in question. Although the operator carries the responsibility of safe joint operation, the railroad responsibility for the controlling joint operation controlling railroad carries the greatest burden to ensure the safety of the such locomotive and train movement. Conducting and controlling the railroad is required to make the minimum before the determination of the engineer has been a certified and qualified engineer by the engineering railroad employer. The engineer has demonstrated the necessary knowledge concerning the controlling railroad operating rules. The railroad is different. If the rules are different, that the engineer has necessary operational skills to safely operate the joint operating territories, and 4, the engineer has necessary familiarity with the physical characteristics of the joint operation territory. Section 240-229C 1 through 4, controlling railroad through the provided of the pilot, qualified person, the company of the locomotive engineer who lacks the joint observation certification is only required to determine the engineer has been certified as a qualified engineer by the engineer railroad employer. Skill controlled railroad may rely on certification issued by the foreign railroad. The FRA concerned with the controlling railroad may abdicate their responsibility to make the 4 determinations required in Statute 240-229C1. This regulation permits the regular reliance on other railroad certification less burdensome alternative to apply full certification programs to the guest railroad engineer. It's Statute 240-229B. At the same time, the regulation still requires the host railroad independently make certain determinations. Section 229C, blinding acceptance for the foreign railroad list qualified engineers does not satisfy the intent of the regulation. In order to make these 4 determinations, the controlling railroad has obligation to make some affirmative actions to ensure the engineer operating over the lines properly trained for those operations. Once the affirmative action is resolved with the probably disparity of the train among these different classes of railroads, thus the engineer class 2 and class 3 may not necessarily receive the same level of training as engineers who receive the same classification for the class 1 railroads. Controlling railroad needs the same method of addressing the concerning of the engineer who would be considered undertrained or procedures set forth in Controller Railroad Part 240 program not allowed in the operate the complex joint operations along with the train operated by the engineers who have been required by the controlling railroad to have the significant more training of the operating environmental failure to adequately address the issue poses a significant threat to the railroad safety. The FRA recommendations additional requirements of Statute 240-229 when any controlling railroad accepts the certification foreign railroad in lieu of issuing an own certification. The FRA recommends the controlling railroad evaluate the training program for the foreign railroad. Controlling railroad review the foreign railroad training program will ensure the foreign engineer have received sufficient training for the operating over the control railroad lines. Controlling railroad follows the recommendation should have the easier time making the required determinations pursuant to Statute 240-229 and will be in compliance with both letter and intent of the regulation. Statute 242.15, retaining the information supporting determinations, audits, and short line railroads. Inspections may request that all Part 240 required records needed for an audit be brought to one location. However, the railroad is not required to keep the Part 240 records in one location. It simply means that the railroad should be, upon the FRA request, make the railroads available within one location for an audit. The 240 requires that records that are kept under the facility will be required to make available to the FRA during the normal business hours. The FRA requests the Part 240 records should be ensured the understanding of those records should be available to mean the responsibility of the time. Alright, 240-223 criteria for the certificate. Each locomotive engineer has received the certificate required under this part to have the certificate of his or her possession while on duty. On the engineer display the certificate would require requesting the FRA representative possession of the certificate on the locomotive engineer. See the guidance of 243.05B, so Part D, administration of certificate programs. 243.03, operational monitoring requirements. 243.03B, operational monitoring observation. If the locomotive engineer is certified in more than one class of service, such as an engineer who had both the RCOs, the train service engineer certificate, the DSLE can sign the monitoring ride for the tree class services conducting one or more of the monitoring rides. A yearly monitoring ride is conducted with the service engineer is working at the time of the monitoring ride takes place. 243 24303C operating rule and compliance test, the FRA considers the failure to engineer to pass the properly conducted operational test subject to provision 24117. However, the FRA Inspector Locomotive Engineering Review Board (LERB) must ensure the operational testing conducted fairly are applied consistently. Operational testing that are not conducted in accordance with the railroad current operational testing program on file or are the same other reasonably intended should not be used to revoke the engineering certificate. Statute 24305 prohibited conduct. The FRA general policy is not assess the civil penalties against the railroad for an alleged violation. One of the cardinal operation rules listed in the statute 24305A, unless the actuation circumstances doing so. The main purpose of the paragraph A is to permit the FRA to initiate the individual ability enforcement action against the person who is not certified locomotive engineer against the certified engineer whose railroad fails to provoke the person's certificate. Under most circumstances, the railroad will initiate the opportunity of revocation hearing, but this under statute 24307, the FRA would not consider the enforcement against the action in the railroad for the such routine handling of the individual engineer alleged violation. The FRA's rationale is that the engineer should be held responsible for their reactions, responsible to have been burdened to enforce the regulation through the suspension and revocation process required in Part 240. The FRA may want to initiate the enforcement action against the railroad in the event that the railroad fails to initiate revocation action under this part. However, it is strongly recommended for the FRA consider with the violation taken under the 24307 that may be more relevant. The FRA may also consider enforcement action under the paragraph A with the investment evidence of the railroad committed with the willful violation. Other instances, paragraph A, the violation may be warranted if and the FRA approved the railroad training and testing of the engineer is inadequate. However, the enforcement perspective, it may offer better to cite the underlying sections of the Part 240 that required adequate testing and training and testing. Paragraph B, guidance regarding possession of the certification. Generally, possession means the right under which one may exercise the control over something in exclusion of others. And if the railroad employs the certificate that the privately owned vehicle or locker, the privately owned vehicle or lockers nearby, the FRA shall consider the compliance with the employee that has exercised adequate control for the possession. In addition, with the certificate employee grips, the grip is easily accessible. The FRA would consider to be the compliance with the same employee cannot be produced and certificate with the FRA inspector with a responsible amount of time to the inspector should good judgment and the inspector's discretion regard enforcement. If inspector makes the decision to write the deficiency recommended with the civil penalty, the inspector must explain the reported specific facts that prevented the engineer to conduct it from being considered compliant. Example would be the engineer who left his certificate of the private owned vehicle has assignment with it. Takes out the engineer out of the yard in the vicinity where the private owned vehicle is parked. The FRA office of the chief would expect the details of why the inspector selected the level of enforcement to be included with the report. Why deciding whether to cite the violation, considered whether the engineer operated a public grade crossing outside of the yard where the certificate was left behind. Paragraph C, guidance regarding locomotive engineers called to exceed certificate limits. Inspectors may cite the individual who does not protest being called for duty which the engineer is unqualified. Similar, paragraph C may be cited against the railroad when the railroad requires an engineer to exceed the certification limitations. Paragraph D, guidance regarding engineers with more than one valid certificate. Inspectors do not often cite this part, but it requires an engineer who has a valid certificate from one more railroad to notify the certifying railroads if the engineer's certification denied for any one of these railroads. 24307 certification revocation. The railroad is responsible for determining whether the rules of violation warrants the suspension of the engineer's certificate because the railroad cannot always make the determination immediately with the regulations, but does not require railroad to prohibit an engineer from operating the train immediately after the occurrence of possible revocable event. Section 24307 provides the railroad with the option of not revoking the certificate under circumstances if the railroad does in fact choose not to revoke the certificate after the revocation event. The railroad should have a record explaining the rationale for the decision, and the record shall have clearly documented that the railroad exercised with good discretion. The FRA will not take enforcement action. The record is maintained if the FRA determines the railroad made in good faith determination after the responsible injury complies with the statute 24307. Multiple decertification events during the same duty tour. The FRA has recently received portions petitions for the engineer who have been decertified by the multiple events during the same time tour of duty, resulting in 1 to 5 years decertification period. In response to these petitions, the FRA has found the regulations silently concerned that constitute the single incident decertification process. The closest regulatory guidance is found in 241.17, which deals with the multiple violations during the course of the signal incident reads as follows: if any of the signal incident personal conduct that can intervene with more than one operating rule practice, the event should be treated as a signal violation for the purpose of this section. The provision prevents the engineer from receiving excessive penalties involving multiple rules of the violation that occurred during the single incident, such as passing a stop signal without the first stopping. The engineer violated with the stop signal, in doing so entered the main track without authority of violating another rule. Under the circumstances, the engineer is only charged with one violation. The provision does not, however, address the events that are part of the original event made by time, circumstance, and distance. They can be argued that unless the nexus of the common denominator between the instance of the operational misconduct, logic, equity, demand, and each of the system instances be treated with as an signal incident. Controversially, multiple incidents can occur during the single tour. There is the least that appears to lack of the progressive disciplinary regulation is based as not to be on the remote possibility that the engineer could report the duty that would be clean record yet, but thereby the time that goes without the duty that he could be subject to 5 or D certification for the commission of 3 certifiable offenses. The FRA policy: a single incident unique in identifying the occurrence caused by the operational error of the engineer. It is possible for the engineer to be involved with more than one single incident during the tour of duty if the incident are separated by the time, distance, circumstance. Recognizing the same cause may cause difficulty calls. The FRA has provided with the following scenarios. Scenario 1. Engineer operating with a train in Chicago, Illinois, Lincoln, Nebraska overlooks a 45-mile-an-hour speed restriction for the car, and his train operates at a maximum speed of 60. He repetitively accelerates to the speed of the action after making an intermediate stop. If the single incident does not need new signal incident occurs each time the engineer operates for over about 45 miles an hour, this is a signal incident. Assume the same fact that scenario that assume the engineer passes a signal requires to stop at Elton and is passing a signal Omaha signal incident. Is their engine therefore subject to the 2 certification proceeding, one of the excessive speeds or one in passing the signal? Yes. A consequent multiple decertification events occurring with a single tour, there appears to be conflict with the intent of the progressively ineligibility period if the certification is applied. Engineers would not be afforded probationary periods between the events of any remedial corrective action. Any or address the paradox for the FRA considered proposing that the decertification periods under the section 240.117 would be revisited. FRA will place the issue of the agenda of the Railroad Safety Advisory Committee for the consideration. Subpart E, dispute of resolution procedures. Public information about the Locomotive Engineering Review Board can be found on the FRA website at the FRA.gov. 240.401 Review Board. Established Locomotive Engineering Review Board. Local inspectors should not be established and not assist the employee applying the writing of the petition presenting to the Locomotive Engineering Review Board. Inspectors should not indicate any of the employee. However, the Locomotive Engineering Review Board will regard any of the issues depending with the Locomotive Engineering Review Board. The issue potential to be applied with the Locomotive Engineering Review Board. This will require the inspectors to investigate Part 240 complaints, but being diligent to that they do not make the statement's conclusion and report findings that they may conflict with unknown or the outcome of the Locomotive Review Board. Inspectors should assist the employee to provide with the information to where they position, submit formats, time limitation, the direction of the Part 240 subpart E dispute resolution procedures. Remote control operators, example, certified locomotive engineers. The RCOs usually separate the class of locomotive operators and with operating locomotive Viva, the remote control transmitter, belt pack, the speed settings of the brake setting, etc. These locomotive engineering classifications are not same with the conventional engineering and usually require fewer skills to operate, may also require shorter training. See picture below. This is a remote control transmitter speed control computer controlled by computer. The speed is reset by the RCO. The computer regulates the speed, same the air brakes. Remote control transmitter throttle air type, automatic brake lever, reverse lever. Throttle and air type of the RCO transmitter, the remote control transmitter that will always require the conventional train service engine classification. As photographed as illustrated, will therefore require more training. That belts also have the spring-loaded throttle. Make controls that require the same skill as the conventional locomotive engineering operating controls inside the locomotive cab. Control levels of the remote control transmit pictured are above the control skill of the locomotive that requires different skills in the remote control operation using the sophisticated transmitter. Alright, this is a railroad stop banners used in operational testing. Which of the following copy the letter of the brother of the locomotive engineering trainman position regarding the stopping banners, stopping signals operation? I don't feel like reading the letters, like that letter, so I'm going to skip that. A wrecking operation. Several accident incidents have been brought to the FRA's attention involving by the operational locomotive's uncertified persons during the wrecking operation. Some of them have been taken to the position that the operations are D- in the nature and that neither directly associated with the railroad operation nor applicable in intended Part 240. Others have indicated the operations are conducted with the personnel located in the close proximity to the equipment. Therefore, since the nature of the requiring expertise training with the intrinsic engineering certification, the definition of FRA includes the engineering certification. Anyone who person who moves a locomotive group of locomotives, confines a locomotive repair service to the area of the testing, servicing, repair, inspection, repairing, building locomotives under the exclusive control of the mechanical departure personnel. The area is protected with a blue signal displayed at the near switching, providing entry to departure from the area. Move the locomotive, the group locomotives, the distance less than 100 feet. The incidental movement of the locomotive of the group locomotives and inspection purposes. The language is clear and unambiguous except for the two exclusions. Nowhere is stated nor intended that anyone in the certified locomotive engineer is permitted to operate a locomotive. The locomotive the car is attached. Conversely, with the language clear that there is no exclusion to where the locomotive may be moved from purposes of inspection maintenance along with a distance of less than 100 feet. Clear movement of the locomotive of the cars during wrecking operations are not provided with the regulation. The primary function of the wrecking operation is to clear the railroad of damaged equipment in the order to restore the service and in so doing not a common with the re-railed locomotive and or equipment to be removed from the locomotive beyond the wreck site, thereby extending the operation of the FRA policy. The FRA believes the operational locomotive during the wrecking operation is beyond the scope of the aforementioned exclusion. Therefore, it requires the railroad to conduct the operation in the same manner as the locomotive operation with a certified engineer. Locomotive Engineer Certification Jurisdiction Qualified Question and Answer. The Railroad Safety Improvement Act of 1988 gave the FRA broad regulatory authority over the national railroads. The term railroad used the act means as all forms of non-highway ground transportation that runs of the rails, electrical magnetic guideways, including the commuter and other short haul rail passenger service, the metropolitan, suburban, as well as the commuter rail service that was operated with the Consolidated Rail Cooperation in January 1st, 1979. High-speed ground on transportation rail system connecting metropolitan areas without regard whether the use of new technology is not associated with the traditional railroads, such as terms not included with the rapid transit with the urban area and are not connected to the general railroad system transportation for the policy reason. The FRA does not exceed jurisdiction under all the regulations full extent prior permitted with the statute. See Title 49 CFR Part 209 Appendix Plant Railroads. The FRA regulation excludes each of the railroad with the entire operation that's combined with the industrial installation or plant railroads, such as steel mills that do not go beyond the plant boundaries. Some of the regulations exclude not only the plant railroads, but also other railroads that are not operated as part of over the lines of the general railroad system transportation. By generally railroad system transportation, the FRA refers to the network standard gauge over which may be transported through the nation in passenger and travel between cities with metropolitan and suburban areas. Much of the network is interconnected such that the vehicle cannot travel across the nation without leaving the system. However, the physical connection of the system does not bring the track within. For example, the track with industrial installation is connected to the network only by a switch of the receipt of the shipment over the system as part of the system. Over course, even with the operation outside of the general system, the railroads are definitely part of the system. May have occasion with the entire enter the first railroad's property. The major railroad goes into the chemical or auto plant to pick up a set of cars. In case of the railroad that is part of the general system remains part of the system while inside the installation, there is also activities covered by the FRA regulations during the period of the plant. Railroad, however, does not go to sweep the general system the virtue of the other railroad except to the extent that it is liable to track owner the condition of the track over the railroad operates during its incursion of the plant. Of course, the opposite situation, the plant required railroad itself is general system and it becomes a railroad to respect the particular operations during the equipment and the crew participates would be subject to the FRA regulations. In some cases, the plant railroad leased track immediately adjacent to this plant is generally systems railroad. Assuming such a lease provides the actual practice entails the exclusive use of the trackage of the plant railroad, general system railroads for the purpose of moving only are shipped to and from the plant. Lease will remove the plant railroad's operation on the track of the general system for the purpose. FRA regulations wouldn't make the trackage of parcel industrial installation. See the Title 49 CFR Part 209 Part A. Appendix A, sorry. Question 1. If I operated a plant railroad that currently exceeds the FRA regulation, however, the building within the plant would be leased to the lumber yard proposed receiving and offloading lumber to cars while I lose my plant railroad status if I handle cars with a new operation or if I begin with handling own cars with its plant. Exclusive answer, yes. The plant railroad exemption is the operational handle cars exclusively that its own operations. If the plant begins handling cars for the other companies, it becomes the common carrier engaged with the switching operation. Taurus Scenic Exclusionary Railroads. The FRA exercises jurisdiction over the Taurus Scenic Excursionary Railroad operations whether or not they conduct the General System Railroad Transportation General System. There are 2 exemptions: operating less than 24-inch gauge, which historically have never been considered railroads under the federal railroad safety laws, and 2, operations that are off General System and ancillary. What does ancillary mean? Ancillary is an issue with regard to the Taurus operation track outside of the general system. Exclusive such as operation of the FRA consider the Taurus track railroad. The ancillary operations are limited to separate enclave, such as away from there is not reasonable expectation of the safety in any member of the public, except for the business and the license of the Taurus operation. If affiliated entity of the trespasser would affect the operation. Class 3. When a Taurus railroad is not considered ancillary, a Taurus operation will not be considered ancillary if one or more of the following exist on the line: a public highway, railway crossing in the use, and a grading railway crossing in the use, a bridge over the public road waters used in commercial navigation, a common corridor in the railroad in the operation within 30 feet of such those of any railroad. Question 4. Does the FRA exercise jurisdiction over the ancillary Taurus railroad? No. Question: does the FRA exercise jurisdiction over non-ancillary railroads? Yes. The following regulation law applies: the Federal Signal Inspection Law, Hazard Material Regulation, Noise Emission Regulation, Freight Car Safety Standards, Accident Incident Report Regulations, Hours of Service Restriction of Duty of Hours, Steam Hours Inspection Steam Locomotive Inspection Regulations, Grade Signal System Safety Regulations, All Power Enforcement Provision of the Railway Safety Statutes, being Authority, Civil Penalty Authority, Disqualification Authority, Emergency Order Authority. Question 6. How would the Taurus serve as the connection to the general system? Clearly define the Taurus option at the beginning with the end. There must be district of servants. The system, there should be no irregular interference with another railroad. The local aid related with the switch, particularly with the derailment, would not render the railroad ancillary or barricade with the sum of the order would impair appropriate the idea to prevent movements from coming onto or going off the affected track. However, the sum of the point of new equipment may be needed to receive on old equipment dispatch or repair the general system and connections. The rare movements of conducted with jeopardizing the Taurus Railway ancillary trains. All right, question 7. I have just been given the permission to operate the extrusion train of the freight train of the trackage as a separate business. How do I certify the engineers for my operation? A few options. 1, I can have the freight railroad engineers operate your train. You can have the freight railroad certify the engineers under the program, issue the employee certificate. You can submit a certification program to the FRA certifying the engineers. Of course, since the freight railroad is host railroad in these operations, is responsible to determine that your engineers are properly certified and qualified and operated on its railroad. Certification program approval. Question: I am starting a new railroad. There is a specified time period, and my certification program should be submitted by the FRA. Yes, the program should be submitted before an approval at least 60 days before commencing operation. 10. I have fulfilled my certification program with the FRA. How do I know when it has been approved? Your program is deemed approved if you do not have the hear or from the FRA within. Your program is deemed approved if you do not hear from the FRA within 30 days of filing date. You will not be notified in writing with the program that the program is approved. Question 10. What if I materially modify the program after I submit it to the FRA? You must resubmit the modified program at least 30 days prior to the implementing modification. Material modifying means a significant change in the training program, changing the individual responsible for maintaining the program. Certificate exclusions. Are there any situations, conditions that would allow non-certified employees to operate the locomotive in a general system? Yes, but only under extremely limited circumstances. The answer is found in the definition section under the regulation under the locomotive engineer. See CFR Title 49, CFR Part 247. The regulation applies to any person who locomotive the group of locomotives, regardless whether they are coupled to rolling equipment, except 1. A person who locomotive the group of locomotives with the confines of the locomotive repairing and service areas provided in Title 49, CFR 285 and 218.29A1. A person who moves the locomotive of the group of locomotives for the distance of less than 100 feet for the incident movement of the locomotive of the group of locomotives for inspection and maintenance purpose. All right. Question 12. What does 49 CFR 218.5 and 218.29A1 mean? The title 49 CFR 218.5 defines a locomotive service tracking area, the one or more tracks within an area, then testing, servicing, repairing, inspection, rebuilding locomotives used in under exclusive control mechanical department personnel. Emphasis added. Title 49 CFR 218.29A1 defines the limited locomotive service area. The section regulation. A blue signal must be displayed on the ear. Each of the switch providing the entire departure of this blue area. The provision of the regulation is easily defined with the limits of the locomotive servicing track area. The blue signal does not have actually displayed for the exclusion of the taking place, but sliding a blue signal limited now are not allowed. The designated switch of the derail entrance of such facilities must be permanent. Eligibility based on the prior safety conduct. Question 13. When I consider the person locomotive in your recertification, what area safety conduct do I evaluate? You are required to evaluate a person's one prior safety conduct of the motor vehicle or prior to the operating rules compliance, prior to the substance abuse disorder and alcohol drug rules compliance. Question 14. Am I in the process of certifying engineer that came from another railroad? The prior employing railroad will not furnish me with the employee service record information for the required employee safety conduct background check. What can I do? You can notify the other railroad that it is a federal requirement that information must be provided with notifying the FRA. Specifically, you are looking for any prior decertification. If you get a piece of paper for the railroad stating that the engineer was not certified that they would certified, the information was not provided, make the note that the employees file and are also notified that the FRA can continue the certification process. Also, note that the regulation requires the engineer to notify the railroads and certain has been revoked. Question 15. When hiring an engineer on another railroad, any difference between the use of the railroad certification title 49, 240, 225, opposing performing the recertification of the engineer, certifying engineer with extensive operating experience in short line program? Yes, if you use an other railroad certification, it will not be necessary for the conduct the motor vehicle check, hearing or visual acuity exam. However, if you still be required for the engineering and knowledge of the skill performance testing and training of the engineer physical characteristics of your railroad. Question 16. When performing the employer prior to the safety conduct and evaluation, the specific time period is involved. Yes, you can only consider the incident occurred within a period of 36 consecutive months of the effective date of the certification decision. Statement Department of Motor Vehicles National Driver Registration Evaluation is a specific time period of evaluating employee motor vehicle driver incident. Yes, it cannot be considered driver incidents that occurred with more than 36 consecutive months effective the date of the certification decision. Question 18. Can I consider the license suspension for the involving speeding? No, you can only consider license suspension that result from the drug or alcohol use of the refusal to test. Question 19. I am having trouble in getting an engineer's motor vehicle records. I can certify the engineer, but for the motor vehicle records have been evaluated. No, all components of the certification must be fulfilled, but you can certify that the engineer, however, there have been problems tracking down an incident that has been identified by the National Driver's Registry. In another state, you can continue the certification process. Say Title 49 CFR Part 244 Appendix C under the actions of probable National Driver Registration match occurs. Question 20. If the engineer required to report the railroad his or her license was suspended because of drugs or alcohol, yes, the engineer has 48 hours to report the suspension of the railroad after the conviction completed state action. Question 24. Some states now suspend motor vehicle licenses on spot. Is the engineer in situation required to report suspension to the railroad at the time? No. Even though the state suspended the motor vehicle's operator license, the engineer has not had his or her day in court. Once it occurs the engineer is convicted, he or she must report the suspension to the railroad at the time. Of course, if the engineer intends to plead guilty to the charge, he or she notifies the railroad ahead of time to begin evaluation process. Once the engineer reports the suspension of the railroad required the immediate suspend the engineer's certificate is the violation warranting a certificate revocation. Answer. There is no answer to both these questions. The railroad required to suspend the engineering certificate. Reliable information. The engineer violated one of the 6 cardinal rules listed in the regulations. See Title 49, 241.17. Or a motor vehicle license suspension is not a violation of any of these rules. Therefore, no certificate, suspension, vote, revocation of the warranted. A driver license suspension merely indicates that the engineer may have substance abuse problem. The railroad only obligation is to refer to the employee to an employee assistant program counselor evaluation. However, this should be done within a responsible time period, for the employee should not be left to work in the work weeks of months without having the employee assistance program counselor evaluation. Question 23. I'm hearing rumors of the National Driver Registry is not going to perform the National Driver Research searches anymore. Is this true? No, the National Driver Research will continue to do searches. Hearing Visual Acuity Examination Title 49, 24121, and 24207. What is the railroad's obligation regarding the hearing on the visual acuity test? The railroad must ensure the person clinically in the performing the test has copied the testing standards outlining the regulation. The railroad cannot assume that the clinic will use the correct standards. As a matter of fact, the clinics may perform the commercial licensing tests, which have different standards. The clinics may see that the form assume the engineer is getting the same test. The railroad should verify that it is not happening. Question 25. If the employee fails the hearing a visual acuity test, the railroad required to perform the additional test. Yes, if a person meeting the hearing a visual acuity test under the requested yes, subject to the medical evaluation in accordance with the guidance appendix prescribed in Appendix F. Regulation, the person entitled with the retest without making any showing it's another retest, the person should be of evidence substantial that the circumstance has changed in the last test, the extent where the person could know the arguable operating locomotive train safety. Question 26. If the engineer fails to hearing the visual acuity test, can the engineer still be certified? Yes, the railroad has determined that the engineer can operate the locomotive train safety without meeting the requirements of regulation. The railroad can still certify the engineer. Knowledge test. Title CFR Title 240-125-209. Knowledge test. Question: If is the knowledge test required to be prior to the certification of typical railroad operating rules that has been given for years? Not quite. Additional operating rules the test should also include personal safety practices, the safety rules, equipment inspection, federal safety rules, any rules related to the regulation of train handling practices, including familiarization, physical characteristics. Question 28. If the engineer is qualified in multiple divisions, must the engineer be tested on the physical characteristics of each of the divisions? Yes, preamble. The final rule clearly states the engineer must be tested on all territories currently qualified on the time of the test. Question 29. And the test be conducted in the workbook fashion where the engineers can refer to the book and order the questions. No, the test must be closed book proctored, and however the portions of the test are designed to the engineer's ability to reference the materials such as timetables, and these materials can be referred to. Performance skills test, Title 49 CFR 240-127-211. With the difference between the performance skill test and monitoring checks to ride, the criteria are both actually the same. The engineer is observed while the operating of the train one or two similarities. However, the performance skill test is required every 3 years prior to the recertification. And the engineering just demonstrates his or her ability to operate the locomotive of the train safely, the monitoring ride, merely the observation and any operation of the locomotive of the train. Third, to receive the monitoring ride, the violation of regulation does not affect the engineering certification. Additional skill, the test must be conducted in the most demanding class of time with the services is typical that persons permitted to perform while the monitoring of the ride does not include needs to be conducted in these conditions. Question 31, can a railroad supervisor what is not engineering conduct a skill test? No, a designated supervisor, local engineer who must be an engineer must be conduct the test. Question 32, can a railroad simulator conduct a skill test? Yes. Monitoring operational performance engineers, Title 49 CFR 241-129-303. If conducted with the engineer monitoring riding in March 2005, do I have the March 2006 to conduct the next check record? No, I determine the annual monitoring obligation uses the calendar year January 1st to December 31st. Question 34, can a monitoring ride conduct with someone of the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer? No. Must the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer, always ride on the locomotive with the engineer to conduct a monitoring ride? No. The railroad cannot evaluate locomotive event recorder data. However, the engineer operating Type 1, Type 2 simulator, thus for these requirements. Question 36. Does the annual check ride fulfill all requirements of the monitoring operating performance of the engineer? No. The railroad must also conduct an operating fully efficient testing each of the calendar year. Question 37. Does the efficiency test date have the document on the certificate? No information can be kept in railroad efficiency test record. Does the date of the last monitored ride have documented on the certificate? No. However, the date must meet the supplementary documents that the engineer must have his or her position with the operating locomotive. However, most railroad include the date of the certified. 39. Is the skill test performed during the last year's certification preparation, issuing a new certificate with the testing satisfy the monitoring required in the last year? Yes. There's a provision in Section 6 of the short line program that addresses the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer, Title 49 CFR 240-105. Must the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer be an engineer? Yes. Must the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer be qualified physical characteristics of territory administrative skills of the monitoring ride? No, the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer is not a pilot. The engineer, the designated supervisor, the locomotive engineer is watching engineer operating with the locomotive train to determine the engineer compliance with the rules. Question 42 was, must the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer be qualified in physical characteristics to qualify the engineer over a particular territory? Yes, the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer must have an immediate and intimate knowledge of the territory. If he or she is required to determine if an engineer knowledgeable about the territory, can he operate over it safely? See Title 49 CFR 242.13 B3. B3. Question 3. Question 43. I have a manager that is also engineering, but with little experience as an engineer. Can I designate the manager as a designated super locomotive engineer? This is the railroad's call. However, the regulation is clear. The designated supervisor locomotive engineer must also be appropriate to take tests to evaluate the knowledge of the skills of the locomotive engineer. They must also possess the necessary supervisor experience, prescribe the appropriate remedial action for any of the deficiencies, training knowledge, and the skill of the person seeking for the retaining certification. It implies that the designated supervisor locomotive engineer must have at least the same skills as the engineer being supervised, preferably better. See Title 49 CFR 240-105. Since I have a new operation, how do I certify the engineers? I do not have designated supervisor locomotive. I perform the skill test that is required prior to the certification. The regulation allows the certificate your first engineer designated that his or her designated supervisor learning locomotive engineering by waiving the skill test requirement at one time only. However, the chief operating officer or any other individual who is responsible for the operation make the determination regarding the designated supervisor learner engineer candidate possesses the necessary professional performance skill in accordance with Title 49 CFR 240-127. The determination should take into account the special operation characteristic unique of the railroad heavy grades. High speed determination should be kept in the DSL file. Must the design supervisor locomotive engineer signature to be on the certificate in addition with the date of the monitoring check ride. No, the regulation only requires the date to be entered in the certificate. However, most of the railroads provided the space the designated supervisor locomotive engineer specific signature as the check ride and to the document no performed check ride. Transferring engineering certifications. Question 46. I have a current valid certification. I had just quitted the railroad A and have been hired by railroad B. Do I have to repeat the entire certification to receive the certification railroad B? No. Title 4 CFR 240-225 allows the railroad to accept certification in another railroad when issuing its own certification. However, the railroad B must make the following determination. The prior certification must be valid, not expired. The prior certification, same class of the purpose of the certification being issued. The engineer has received its training, visually observed the physical characteristics of the new territory, documented training. The engineer training with the operating is different. The knowledge test must be documented and placed in file. While the engineer demonstrated the necessary performance skills to operate over the new railroad skill test must be documented in place of the file. The process eliminates the need for the railroad B to perform the hearing and visual acuity test, the National Driving Register, and the State Motor Vehicle Operational License test. When issuing a new certificate, however, the railroad should carry over the old certificate's expiration date. It's question 47. In the same scenario, when the engineer certificate has expired, refer to the standard short line certification language. It also applies to the standard race certification of the engineer, who is one exception. Since the engineer is new to the railroad, you must have a designated supervisor locomotive engineer evaluated the engineer to determine how much the on-job training will be needed. If and any, how many trips will be necessary for the engineer to learn the physical characteristics of the new territory. The procedure can also help apply to the engineers who have never been certified, who have then experienced in the engineer. Would have experience in the engineer. Transferring engineers to the designated supervisor locomotive engineer from one railroad to another when owned by the same company. When owned by the same company, I own several railroads. On occasion, I need to transfer engineering designated supervisor locomotive engineer from one railroad to the other. Since I own all the railroads, I can just send the employee to the railroad. No, if the separate program operating rules each of the railroad that you can transfer according to Title 49 CFR 240-225, the section allows you the current form of certification when issuing the certificate for the new railroad. If you use the certificate under the parent company name instead of the individual railroads, if you use the same operational rules certification program for all the railroads, the following will apply. When your employee arrives at the new railroad, you must qualify him or her the railroad the competence requiring the employee to complete the certain number of the qualifying trips. Following the completion of the qualification trip, the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer, the railroad must determine the transfer engineer can safely operate the train. The new railroad check ride. Sometimes documentation should be placed in the employee file to sometimes above procedure file to provide transfer engineering properly qualified to new territory. If the railroad conducts a joint operation, transferred engineer is expected to operate the joint operation territory. The transferred engineer must also qualify in the territory as well as the qualification procedures controlled in the foreign railroad. It is important to note that you should prepare to send the rest of the employee's files of the railroad. The FRA inspector requests certain records of the employee conducting the inspection on the railroad. The above procedures are similar to large railroads, sending the engineers to qualify on the main division identification of the qualified personnel. Title 49, CF 24221. Question 49. You need not to send a list of the designated supervisor, locomotive engineers, and engineers to the FRA. No, however, the list of the designated supervisor, locomotive engineers, and engineers must be maintained on the railroad. Question 50. Do I need any other information on the list? Yes, I should include the class of service of the engineer qualified to perform, the date of the railroad certification decision. Special Equipment Certification Issues, Title 49 CFR Part 24104. The question 51. What is the difference between specialized roadway maintenance equipment and dual-purpose vehicles? Specialized road maintenance equipment is equipment that does not have the capability, no couplers to move the railroad rolling stock, freight, passenger. A double-purpose vehicle is a piece of the track on the equipment capable of moving the railroad rolling stock. Question 52. Do I need a certified engineer to move specialized road maintenance equipment? No. Question 53. I need no certification. I do need certification engineer to move the dual-purpose vehicle. This depends on how the dual-purpose vehicle is being used. If you're using a dual-purpose vehicle to perform routine switching operation of very new service, then you need a certified engineer to operate it. You do not need a certified engineer to operate dual-purpose vehicles if the vehicle is, one, being operated in conjunction with the railroad maintenance and ways of function, including traveling or from the work site, moving under the authority of the railroad operating rules designated with the movement of the railroad maintenance equipment to ensure the protection of the equipment such that from train movements being operated in the individual train qualified in accordance with Section 214, 31, 34, 343, 355, Roadway Protection Rules, see Title 49 CFR 240-104, A2. Certification Records, Title 49 CFR 240, 215. How long must I keep a certification record? All certification records must be kept for 6 years from the date of certification. Question 55. Can I make a certification record in electronic format? Answer 55. Yes. Provided that the railroad adequately limits the controls that access to such information. The railroad employs the system of the data storage to permit the reasonable access to the retrieval information to use the format the requested furnished data FRA representative. Information retrieved from the system that can be easily produced and printed, which can be readily provided with the FRA represents authenticated with the designated representative with the railroad true accurate copy of the railroad records procedure that you do so the representative. Do I have to make the records available to the FRA? Yes, I've requested to furnish the records during the normal business hours. Can I keep the records at a certain central location if I own multiple railroads? Yes, however, you should be prepared to transmit records in individual railroads being audited with the FRA. Decertification procedures. Question 58 is decertification engineer without holding a hearing. No, the engineer is entitled to the hearing unless the engineer waives his or her right to the hearing. Question 58. Any special requirements the waiver must conform to? Answer: yes. The waiver must be made in writing, reflect the fact that the person has knowledge and understanding of these rights, voluntarily surrenders them, be signed of the person making the waivers. Question 60. Do I have to file any special procedures to hold the hearing? Yes, I have the collection bargaining agreement on the property. You can hold the clarification hearing in accordance with the agreement. If you do not have the hearing procedures for the Title 49 CFR 24307, the section containing the hearing procedures may be followed. Audit protocols, Part 240, audits of smaller railroad operations. The following procedure will assist the inspector to conduct the railroad audit of the railroad locomotive engineering certificate program associated with the railroad. Keeping the requirements, the protocols are designed to be guidance with the Title 49 CFR regulations. Part 240, smaller railroad operations. Part 240 of larger railroads classes 1, inspectors should consult with the Federal Railroad Management to provide any audit efforts. The nature of the audit, it requires a specific consideration coordinated with the maximum inspection efforts. It is recommended that the inspector use the provided with the job audits to help record organize information that use the job aids will assist the preparation of the inspection and subsequent violation reports that may result in an audit protocol. The audit protocol is divided into 4 elements prior to the audit, conducting the audit, documentation, closing, and the following up of the jobs aids. 243 application responsibility and compliance. Inspector accounts for the tourists of the railroads. They do not operate over the general railroad system. Those do not own the track of the part general railroad system. Ancillary or non-ancillary. Inspector should reference the FRA general manual, specifically with the FRA exercise decision tree. Prior to the audit review, the Part 240 program and the implementation requirements in Part 240 permits each of the railroad to have their own certification program. Imperative the inspector's knowledge of the specific railroad program and audit understand the program requirements will allow the inspector to determine the compliance, non-compliance of regulation. Part 240 program are approved by the FRA headquarters. Therefore, the operational practice field inspector should not take exemptions to the substance of Part 240 program itself. If the program disciplinary discovered during the audit, an inspector should consult with their own regional operational specialist prior to taking the following formal explanation of the railroad. The issue should be handled with the appropriate FRA chain of the command of resolution. The fourth, the successful audit, the inspector should be familiar with the general consent with the Part 240 of the program, review the railroad program information that will be enabled to determine compliance. If the railroad program is current, the certification program on the file with the FRA. If the railroad contractor maintains a record of certified locomotive engineers records to maintain off-site location of the training requirements outlined the program requirements, the selection criteria, the designated supervisor, locomotive engineer, designated supervisor, remote control operators, designated supervisor, locomotive engineer, designated supervisor, control operators, of additional requirements being as a certified locomotive engineer, remote control operator. The program requirements for the class of the certified employer engineers operating for the railroad, the annual monitoring ride criteria such as the length, time, and the location, class, service simulator, event record, and etc. The skill performance evaluation notice, evaluation certification weighted scores as required in Part 240 regulation, updated in February 2010. We're going to skip the note. We're going to go on to the contact of the railroad prior to the audit. It is recommended the inspector contact the railroad in advance to determine that the documented list of documented request job aid will be available to review during the audit. The rail consortium of the Rail America, Waco, Gensco, Wyoming Railroad, etc. maintain the record of the central location if documented with available requested for the audit. Inspectors shall contact with regional specialist guidance to resolve the issue. In addition to the documented list of the documented requested aid, the inspector should ensure that there will be means of copy the evidence of the key railroad managers, the president, and assist their secure location of the available railroad to perform an audit, communicate the railroad the precise time, place, and audit conducted. Conducting the audit operational practice field inspector should include the scope of the audit, whether the railroad in compliance with its own Part 240 program. If the opinion of the inspector railroad does not properly implementing the railroad owns training program, the discussion should take place with the regional specialist to determine the enforcement operation. The railroad regional operational specialist must consider whether the same program in effect with the operational others inspector territories of the FRH regions of the SO agents is to enforce the consistency. All right. Certified review of list of certification engineers that may be included separately may be maintained individual's record of 240, 221, AB, and this list should include the class service certification date of the employee compared to the list to the current roster trained service engineer work on the railroad. Cross-referencing list of the note of the railroad hours of the service records inspection. The hours of the service records may reveal the employees working as engineers had not have been documented. The appropriate list of were not properly certified. The discrepancy should be warranted in close review of the related records. The following suggested areas are focused, targeting the designated super locomotive engineer, the designated super remote control and not engineer roster, scrutinize the supervisor's local qualifications, target any engineer on the engineer roster, scrutinize the engineer's qualifications, to ensure the engineer records from the railroad, and if applicable, the prior safety conduct, to ensure the engineer previously certified in good standing, and if inappropriate, obtain the review list of the previous engineers, including locomotive engineer supervisors no longer employed by the railroad, who are employed by the railroad but are not working as locomotive engineers. Target those engineers, scrutinize the records to determine whether these reasons were dismissed or resigned. Target the engineers, scrutinize the records to determine if they were properly certified working in locomotive engineering certified service. Designated supervisor locomotive engineer qualification. Section 2, qualified certification, describes the criteria of railroad using the selection of the designated supervisor or locomotive engineer to determine the procedure to follow. Cross-reference the name of the designated supervisor or locomotive engineer on the mounting ride and skill test forms, listing of the designated supervisor or locomotive of the remote control to ensure the proper individual performing the procedure. Note, newly appointed designated supervisor or locomotive engineer may not be on the list, since the list is only required to update it annually. Classes of service. Review the different classes of certified engineers to determine the extent of the compliance by the railroad certification program. Review the record to determine the compliance of the engineers operating the class or disqualified under the operation hours of service. Certified holsters working in the train service engineer. Review the record to determine the designated supervisor, locomotive conducting skills and monitoring rides for qualified in class service time at the time she or he conducts the check ride. Reviewing the written knowledge test, reviewing the closed book, open book portion of the written knowledge test for all the applicable requirements of the Title of State 40-125. At a minimum, test should cover the following subjects: personal safety practice, operational practice rules, equipment inspection, train handling, including familiarity with the physical characteristics of federal regulations. Minimum passing requirements should be located in Section 4 certification program, reviewing the individual locomotive engineer records, including the designated supervisor, locomotives, and DCROs. Review each of the locomotive designated locomotive engineer or DCROCOs for the documented related certification criteria. Motor vehicle driver's record search and conducted not more than 365 days prior to the certified date. A hearing, vision, and acuity conducted with more than 360 days prior to the certification date. Completion of the training requirements found in the Part 240 program. Railroads are not only required to keep the 6 years per 240-215 substantial intellectual records of the old engineers may be not available. Knowledge testing conducting not more than 366 days prior to their certification. Skill performance testing must be conducted by the designated supervisor locomotive, the DSRCO, conducting not more than 366 days prior to certification. Prior safety conduct the previous certified with another railroad prior to the railroad service record, if applicable. An annual monitoring record must be conducted with the calendar. An announced efficiency test must be conducted during the calendar. Revocations, procedure related to decertification, inquire if both in the certification revocations to require railroad to terminate the proper revocation procedure followed by the EIE notification certification, suspension hearing, the conducting hearing with the waiver signed properly, revocation, proper revocation period assessed, revocation records should be included but not limited to the notification, suspension, notification, revocation, training, assessment required prior to any locomotive engineer returning to the locomotive engineer prior to serving the entire revocation period, complete any remedial training required for the assessment noted above. Documentation regarding any decision railroad not to revoke the certificate locomotive engineer involved in the revocation activity. Interview the employees. When participating in inspectors should interview locomotive engineers, operating employee services regarding the information relevant to 240. Interviewers should include inspection certification compliance with the applicable section, Part 240, the possession certificate, compliance with the certification restriction to use the glasses, hearing, and aids. If applicable, inspectors should then cross-reference the information obtained with the interview with the audit, questioning the employees may be generally nature and the assisting identification problems from the implementation of the certification program, otherwise known as to the inspector. Documentation closed meeting and the following up inspection. Documentation the inspection does not documented comprehensive Part 240 audit activity. The FRA inspects reports using operating practice code CPR. Narrative portion of the inspection report should clearly explain all the relevant inspection activity. To claim the activity code CPR on the smaller railroad operation, the inspector should have completed all relevant requirements for current certification and locomotive engineering audit protocols. Alright, all defects must be noted to use inappropriate defects use the common RSPIC codes, job, aids, and list, line items, narratives associated with the defects if showed accurately, clearly descriptive non-compliance. Any associated violation report should be note the non-compliance discovered during the audit of the railroad locomotive engineering certification. Closeout meaning during the course of the audit, the inspector will notify the railroad as discrepancy discovered. In conclusion of the audit, the inspector must formally meet the representative of the railroad, summarize the present of overall findings of the audit. Close out the meeting should include the motives, the positive as well as negative aspects of the audit. Follow-up and re-inspection. The inspector should expect the following non-compliant issues that are resolved. The inspector should track railroad of efforts to achieve the compliance using the proper source code of the re-inspection in their 96 inspection records reports as result, as well known as the following inspection narrative portion and follow-up report. Conclusion: the thorough audit inspection records should reveal the railroad compliance with Part 240. In order to the audit, the very viable inspection tool imperative to each of these sections of the regulation outlined above to check the compliance to assist the process. Documented request job aid is a common RSBIC code. Job aid engineering certificate audit job aid certification dated. The worksheet attached engineering certification audit job aid follows the relevant section regulation and is an excellent tool for determining certification status. Individual engineers certification date work will assist to keep track of the employee's records revealed. All right, job aid. Notify the railroad prior to the audit. The following documents should be available in the audit. The following documents are required to supply with the railroad inspection: a copy of the current engineer Part 240 program, a copy of the amendments to the railroad Part 240 program, a roster certified engineer, and include the employees and management identified with the designated supervisor, locomotive engineers, or DCS or RCOs, efficiency training record of the certified engineers, including DSLEs, a record of the year mounting the rear engineer's years, the designated locomotive engineers, training records of the engineers, including the designated supervisor locomotive engineers, may not be available for the older engineers because of maximum 6-year retention. Visual hearing acuity testing, documenting passing, and acceptable unless specific notations. Determine if the railroad has provided medical facility responsible for conducting the acuity test properly. Criteria is described under Section 241, 21, 240, 207. Clinics may be used federal motor character. Clinics may be using the federal motor character safety administrative standards for the test and will differ from the federal railroad administration requirements. State the federal motor vehicle required as required in Part 240 prior to the railroad safety conduct if applicable. Alright, the job aid common RSBICs, defects of the RSIPCs are not always contained in the actual code of the federal regulations. Text of Part 240, the following proper to the cities should be entered into the RSBICC systems and documented and non-compliant with this list contains some of the most common violations noted in Part 240 audit and is not exclusive. 242-203A1, no state national driver registration, no motor vehicle. 242-203A2, no hearing visual record. 242-203A3, no knowledge test. 243A4, no skill performance test. 242-205B, the driver under influence DUI occurs in the initial recertification period of 3 years. There should documentation employee assistance program council validated locomotive engineering substance abuse disorder. It does not have a disorder. 242.07, the railroad has issued the certification of the person demonstrated with division and the hearing the deficiency is prescribed. In 241.21, no medical follow-up determining the extent of the acuity. 242.11a, the record provided with the railroad indicates the engineer received the specific skills performance evaluation. However, the evaluation is not the most demanding of skill services anticipated with the railroad. There was a failure documented with the student actual performed with the required on-the-job training. The railroad records merely indicate that the student showed up for work, but failed to indicate that the student operated the locomotive remote control operated for the time prescribed on the railroad program. 243.03, the failure to conduct the yearly monitoring event to check the ride or not. To the 243.03, the failure was conducted the yearly efficiently year tested indicated with the railroad program may or may not be stop signal tests. All right, your job aid certification worksheet. The determination of certification eligibility and retaining information, employee name, railroad certified, issued and effective date, current DSL trained service engineer, locomotive service engineer, student engineer, DSS ROC, ROC or student ROCO. And then the next page is a knowledge test, physical acuity, motor vehicle driving records, prior railroad information, and skill performance tests and monitoring operational performance annual check and monitoring requirements annual and announced efficiency tests, operating rule compliance declare this certification, and that should do it for the certification data worksheet. Name of the engineer certification, MV record state, national visual hearing knowledge skill test, detect ride, facility tests and notes. Chapter 17 is conductor certification and it's pending. That means there's nothing left. Thank you.